by 2026, over 1 million Australians could be at risk of losing their homes. That's not a prediction from a sci-fi film. It's what housing experts, economists, and frontline charities are warning right now. Rent is skyrocketing. Mortgages are unmanageable. And the dream of owning a home? For many, it's becoming a cruel joke. But how did we get here? It's not just bad luck or a slowing economy. Behind the scenes, a perfect storm is brewing, made of broken policies, unchecked corporate greed, and a shocking lack of action from those in power. While politicians talk about affordability, families are being evicted, young people are locked out of the market, and even full-time workers are lining up at shelters. Something isn't just wrong, something is deeply broken. In this video, we'll uncover the top 10 reasons behind Australia's looming housing disaster. Some will surprise you, others might make you angry, but all of them will open your eyes. Number 10. The collapse of social housing programs. Imagine working 2 jobs, raising a family, and still being unable to afford a roof over your head. For thousands of Australians, that's no longer just a fear, it's reality. And one of the biggest reasons is the collapse of social housing across the country. Social housing, once a vital safety net for low-income families, has been slowly eroded over the past few decades. In the 1980s, government-funded housing made up over 6% of Australia's housing stock. Today, that number has dropped to less than 4%, despite the population increasing by millions. The result? More vulnerable Australians are being pushed into an already overcrowded and overpriced private rental market. What's worse, waiting lists for public housing are growing longer every year. In states like New South Wales and Victoria, families can spend over a decade waiting for a place to live. And while demand is rising, funding has been stagnant, or in some cases, cut entirely. This shortage is not just a number, it has real human consequences. Survivors of domestic violence, the elderly, single parents, and people with disabilities are all finding themselves with nowhere to turn. Instead of having a stable home, many end up in emergency shelters, motels, or worse, on the streets. When a country stops investing in housing for its most vulnerable citizens, it sends a clear message: you're on your own. And when social housing collapses, it doesn't just affect the poor, it puts more pressure on the private market, raising rents for everyone. So while the headlines talk about market trends and interest rates, this quiet crisis in social housing is quietly pushing Australia toward a national disaster, one family at a time. Number 9. Overseas investment driving up prices. Ever wondered why a modest 2-bedroom unit in Sydney now costs more than a luxury flat in some European cities? One major reason is that Australia's housing market has become a goldmine for foreign investors, and everyday Aussies are paying the price. In the past decade, billions of dollars have poured in from overseas buyers, particularly from China, the US, and Singapore. In fact, in 2024 alone, foreign investment in Australian residential property surpassed $13 billion, the highest in years. These investors aren't buying homes to live in. They're buying assets, often sight unseen, just to park their money in a safe and high-growth market. And here's the twist. Many of these properties sit empty. That's right, entire apartment blocks in major cities like Melbourne and Brisbane have lights off at night, not because no one wants to live there, but because the owners don't need tenants. They're holding the property for capital gain, not rental income. This trend pushes housing prices even further out of reach for Australians. First home buyers, already struggling with rising costs and stagnant wages, are now competing against cash-rich international investors who can outbid them in seconds. To make matters worse, regulations around foreign ownership are full of loopholes. Despite attempts to restrict certain purchases, many buyers use local proxies, shell companies, or commercial loopholes to get around the rules. The result? Prices keep rising, supply shrinks for locals, and the dream of home ownership drifts even further away. When homes become investment portfolios for people overseas rather than places for Australians to live, the system is no longer working, it's being exploited, and the people paying the price are the ones just trying to build a life. Number 8. Wage stagnation versus rent inflation. You've probably heard it, or even said it yourself. I'm earning more, but somehow I'm still falling behind. That's because while wages have barely moved in the past decade, rents have exploded, and the gap is tearing working Australians apart. Let's look at the numbers. Between 2014 and 2024, real wages in Australia grew by less than 5%. In the same period, rents in major cities surged by over 30%. In places like Brisbane and Perth, rent hikes in just the last 2 years have reached double digits. And it's not just capital cities. Regional towns once seen as affordable are now feeling the crunch. For millions of Australians, rent now eats up 40% or more of their monthly income. That's well above the internationally recommended benchmark of 30%. What does that mean in practice? Less money for food, medicine, transport, and education. Families are being forced to choose between heating their homes or paying the rent on time. And it's not just low-income earners feeling the squeeze. Nurses, teachers, hospitality workers, people with stable, full-time jobs are now being priced out of the very communities they serve. In some areas, essential workers are commuting over 2 hours a day just to afford rent in distant suburbs. Meanwhile, landlords continue to lift prices with little oversight, taking advantage of limited rental stock and desperate tenants. With demand outweighing supply, the power imbalance is staggering, and renters have little to no bargaining power. This isn't just a housing issue, it's an economic crisis. When the cost of living outpaces income, it becomes impossible to build a future. And if this wage-rent gap keeps growing, millions more could soon find themselves without a place to call home. Number 7. Airbnb short-term rentals taking over neighborhoods. Once upon a time, renting out your spare room on Airbnb was just a side hustle. Now it's become a major player in Australia's housing crisis, and it's pricing everyday people out of their own communities. Across Australia, especially in tourist hotspots like Byron Bay, Hobart, and inner-city Melbourne, property owners are converting long-term rental homes into short-term holiday stays. Why rent to a family for a year when you can charge tourists triple the rate for a weekend? The numbers are staggering. In some regions, up to 1 in 5 properties is now listed on short-stay platforms like Airbnb or Stays. That's thousands of homes that used to house local families, now sitting empty during the week, waiting for the next tourist check-in. The result? Fewer long-term rentals, skyrocketing prices, and an increase in housing instability, especially for locals who work in these very communities: hospitality staff, teachers, nurses. People who once lived minutes from work are now being pushed out to the fringes or forced to leave town entirely. Worse still, many short-term rentals are unregulated. They dodge safety inspections, avoid tenancy laws, and don't contribute meaningfully to housing solutions. Some landlords even evict stable tenants just to flip their properties into Airbnbs overnight. In the rush to profit off tourism, we've turned homes into hotels, and it's leaving real people, families, workers, students, without a place to live. When housing becomes a business model instead of a human right, it's not just the market that suffers. Communities break apart, and the very character of our cities and towns begins to disappear. Number 6. Urban zoning laws. NIMBYism blocking new housing. Believe it or not, one of the biggest reasons we don't have enough homes in Australia isn't just money. It's rules, red tape, and resistance from the neighbours. Across the country, outdated zoning laws and a growing wave of NIMBYism, that's short for not in my backyard, are stopping new housing developments before they even begin. Even when councils approve plans for affordable housing or medium-density apartments, local residents often protest, claiming it will ruin the character of their suburb. The result? In high-demand areas like Sydney's North Shore or Melbourne's Inner East, developers face endless delays, appeals, and restrictions. It's far easier to build sprawling estates on the city's edge than to build smart, sustainable, and affordable homes near jobs, schools, and public transport. But here's the problem. When we limit new housing in well-connected areas, we push people further away, into distant suburbs with longer commutes, fewer services, and higher transport costs. That doesn't just strain families, it puts pressure on roads, infrastructure, and the environment. And it's not just new buildings being blocked. In many cities, rules forbid subdividing large lots or adding granny flats, even when there's plenty of space. We're sitting on underused land, but legal barriers stop us from using it wisely. Meanwhile, the demand for housing continues to grow, and with supply locked up by regulation, prices keep climbing. If we want to solve this crisis, we need to rethink what our neighbourhoods should look like. Because until we overcome fear of change and start building smarter, we're leaving entire generations locked out of the places they call home. Number 5. Interest rate hikes are forcing families out. For many Australians, the dream of home ownership has turned into a nightmare. thanks to relentless interest rate hikes that keep tightening the noose on household budgets. Since mid-2022, the Reserve Bank of Australia has lifted interest rates over a dozen times, sending mortgage repayments through the roof. A typical mortgage holder is now paying $1,200 to $2,000 more per month than they were just 2 years ago. And for new buyers, forget it. Even with a healthy deposit, most are simply priced out of the market. The pain is real. Families who once felt financially stable are now missing payments, dipping into savings, or being forced to sell their homes. Repossessions are climbing, refinancing is harder than ever, and the banks, they're tightening lending standards just when people need breathing room the most. But it doesn't stop there. As homeowners struggle, landlords pass their increased mortgage costs onto renters, creating a vicious cycle where no one wins, except the banks. This isn't just a financial adjustment, it's a systemic shock to the middle class, creating a growing class of people who did everything right, worked hard, saved up, bought a home, only to find the rules changed mid-game. The worst part? If rate hikes continue without targeted housing relief, millions more could lose the one thing that should never feel temporary, their home. We pour days of research and editing into every video to bring you the truth no one else is talking about. So if this opened your eyes, hit subscribe. It's just one click, but it means the world to us. And tell us in the comments, what's housing like where you live? Your story might help someone else feel less alone. Number 4, weak tenant protection laws are fueling insecurity. Imagine paying your rent on time, taking care of your home, and still living in fear of being kicked out with barely any notice. For millions of renters in Australia, this isn't imagination, it's everyday life, thanks to weak tenant protection laws that leave them exposed and powerless. In many states, landlords can still issue no-grounds evictions, meaning they don't even need a reason to force someone out. Sometimes it's because they want to raise the rent. Other times it's to convert the property into an Airbnb or to sell at a profit. The bottom line? Tenants have little to no security, even when they follow every rule. Add to that the lack of long-term leases in most regions. While other countries offer 3, 5, even 10-year rental agreements, most Australian leases roll over every 6 to 12 months. That means renters are constantly living in limbo, unsure where they'll be living next year or next month. For families with kids, this is devastating. Moving frequently means changing schools, losing community ties, and taking a financial hit with every relocation. It also affects mental health, especially for vulnerable groups like single parents, low-income earners, and the elderly. And while rental prices soar, there's often nowhere else to go. The lack of legal protections means renters are afraid to report unsafe conditions or unfair practices, fearing retaliation or eviction. At a time when more Australians are renting than ever before, the system continues to treat them like second-class citizens. Until tenant rights are treated as human rights, Australia's housing crisis will continue to worsen, because a house without security isn't truly a home. Number 3, the decline of home ownership across generations. There was a time when owning a home was considered a basic life milestone in Australia. Work hard, save up, and eventually buy a place to call your own. But today, that dream is slipping away, especially for younger generations. Home ownership rates among Australians aged 25 to 34 have plummeted, from nearly 60% in the 1980s to under 40% today. And for many in their 20s and 30s now, owning a home isn't just delayed, it's looking completely out of reach. Why? Because housing prices have surged far beyond wage growth. In just the past 2 decades, property values in cities like Sydney and Melbourne have tripled, while real incomes have barely budged. Add in massive student debt, rising cost of living, and job insecurity, and you have a generation that's locked out of the market through no fault of their own. It's not just affecting young people either. Many older renters who never managed to break into the housing market are now heading into retirement without secure housing, something that was unthinkable just 1 generation ago. This growing divide is creating a 2-tier society, those who own property and build wealth, and those who rent forever and fall further behind. And as fewer people can afford to buy, the demand for rentals explodes, driving up rents and pushing more people into housing stress. If home ownership continues to decline at this rate, we're not just losing houses, we're losing hope. Because when an entire generation feels like they're locked out of a basic life goal, it doesn't just affect the housing market. It affects mental health, family planning, financial stability, and the future of the nation itself. Number 2, corporate ownership of housing is reshaping the market. What happens when homes are no longer built for people, but for profit margins? That's the harsh reality Australia is facing as corporations and investment funds increasingly buy up residential properties, turning homes into financial assets and tenants into revenue streams. In recent years, we've seen a massive rise in institutional landlords, superannuation funds, real estate investment trusts, REITs, and multinational corporations purchasing entire apartment complexes and housing developments. Their goal isn't to create communities, it's to generate returns for shareholders. Unlike traditional landlords, these corporations operate on a mass scale, using data algorithms to adjust rent prices based on market trends, not human need. If the system says people will pay more, they raise the rent. No empathy, no flexibility, just cold, calculated business. This trend has a chilling effect on renters. As corporate landlords gain more control, the competition for affordable housing shrinks. Smaller landlords get squeezed out and renters face fewer choices and less bargaining power. It's a one-way street. You pay what they want or you leave. Even worse, these corporations often lobby against tenant protections, using their wealth and influence to shape housing policies in their favor. That means more loopholes, weaker regulations, and fewer rights for renters. When housing becomes an investment tool for billion-dollar companies, it stops being about shelter, safety, or community. It becomes a commodity, and people become collateral. If we don't place limits on corporate ownership now, we risk a future where only the rich can afford to live securely, and everyone else is left scrambling for what's left. Because in a corporate-owned housing market, the price of a home may go up, but the value of being human goes down. Number 1. Policy paralysis, political inaction. Of all the reasons behind Australia's housing crisis, this one hurts the most, because it could have been prevented. Despite all the warnings, research, and public outcry, we're still stuck in a cycle of policy paralysis and political inaction. For decades, governments on both sides have promised to tackle housing affordability. Yet year after year, we see band-aid solutions, temporary grants, and flashy announcements with very little long-term change. Meanwhile, the real issues, like housing supply, tax reform, and renter protections, remain largely untouched. Why? Because fixing the housing crisis means challenging powerful interests. Real estate developers, large-scale investors, and wealthy property owners all benefit from the current system. And with negative gearing, capital gains tax concessions, and other investor-friendly loopholes still intact, there's little incentive for politicians to rock the boat. Worse still, federal and state governments often blame each other, passing the responsibility back and forth while families fall through the cracks. The result? Decades of delay, with no meaningful strategy to ensure housing is treated as a basic human right, not just an investment class. We already have the data. We already have the solutions. Experts have called for public housing investment, tighter regulation of short-term rentals, rezoning reforms, and tax overhauls. But without political will, nothing changes. And that's the tragedy. While everyday Australians struggle to keep a roof over their heads, the people in power keep making excuses. Until our leaders find the courage to act, not just talk, the housing crisis won't just continue, it will get much worse. This isn't a future problem, it's happening right now, and unless we demand action, millions could be left without a place to call home by 2026. Australia's housing crisis didn't appear overnight, and it's not the result of one simple cause. It's the outcome of a system that's been failing quietly for years, built on profit, politics, and neglect. From soaring rents and shrinking wages to policy failures and unchecked corporate greed, every piece of the puzzle tells the same story. Housing is no longer working for the people. But here's the thing, this crisis is not inevitable. It's the result of choices made by those in power, and it can be changed by the choices we make now. Whether you're a renter, a homeowner, or still dreaming of owning one day, this affects all of us. It's about more than property. It's about security, dignity, and the right to a stable life. The road ahead won't be easy. But the first step is awareness, because the more we understand what's broken, the louder we can demand it be fixed. If you've made it this far, you're already part of the solution. Let's keep the conversation going, for ourselves, our neighbours, and the generations to come.